5 Live Formula One.
Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to coverage of round 4 of the 2025 Formula One World Championship. We're in Bahrain for this one, about 8,000 kilometres as the crow flies from Suzuka. The filling of F1's first triple header of the year. Last practice session on the way for you before we get into the really good stuff and qualifying under the lights later on. So let's see what our teams and drivers have got up their sleeves for this one. Alongside myself, Harry Benjamin, is the former McLaren mechanic Mark Priestley and the BBC's F1 correspondent Andrew Benson. And Mark, well, somebody's going to have to pull out something, aren't they, if we're going to take it to McLaren for the remainder of the weekend. Half a second clear at the end of Friday's running.
Yeah, and that was the one lap pace that we saw in free practice 2, which is the sort of all-out pace on the soft tyres and low fuel runs. That's a precursor of what we can expect in qualifying. But when you look at the long runs later on in that same session, when they fill the cars up with fuel and they're simulating their much longer race stints, it was pretty much a very similar picture. So ominous for all the other competitors who have any hope of trying to challenge them this weekend. The one caveat might be that it is only Friday, and you never know quite exactly which fuel loads people are running and what engine modes they're running as well. We typically see Red Bull take a step between Friday and Saturday. The big question is going to be, is that step going to be anywhere near enough to try and close that gap down?
Yeah, a couple of new bits being brought for some of those top teams. McLaren with a new front corner on their car. Red Bull looking for more performance from their front wing. Yuki Tsunoda in yesterday's practice session trying a completely new setup as he tries to get to grips with his new machinery. He was nowhere at the end of Friday's running. But Ferrari, all hopes rushing through on a new floor for this weekend. But yet again, with the caveat of it being Friday, it still didn't seem like they had much going for them.
Yeah, because any team that brings a substantial upgrade, and this is a reasonable size upgrade, the floor which it all centres around is a major component, particularly in the modern era of Formula One. A lot of the downforce is produced from the underfloor section. So, whether they said it publicly or not, internally they would have been hoping for a dramatic improvement. That's always what you hope when you bolt some new bits on the car, and we certainly didn't see that. That doesn't mean that you can't fine-tune the car to then, over time get the best out of that new part and that new configuration. So they will still hope there's improvements to come, but it certainly wasn't the night and day difference that I think everyone in red would have been hoping for. What
about George Russell in the Mercedes? He looked rather quick at the end of Friday's running, really the closest man to the McLarens. Andrew, what's your summation of Mercedes' overall start to the season, how they might fare this weekend?
Well, just on this weekend, I think Russell was the closest guy to the McLarens yesterday, and he made a mistake on his flying lap, so that mistake more or less accounted for the difference, not quite, but because it was half a second between the McLarens and Russell, but not, it would have closed quite a lot of that gap. I think, from Mercedes' point of view, it's obviously not what they want. They want to be winning races, but in terms of the context of the ground effect era since 2022, this is definitely their most convincing start to a season. They seem to have finally mostly got on top of the rules. The car is behaving in the way they want it to do. It's pretty consistently competitive. He's had 2 podiums out of the 3 Grand Prix, so it's been good, solid start to the year, I would say, for Mercedes. But McLaren, I think you've got to say, that car is super impressive. And I think they only lost Japan because neither of the drivers quite got their qualifying lap together. I think if either of those drivers had ended up ahead of Verstappen, he wouldn't have seen them for dust in the Grand Prix. It's just he was in front and overtaking wasn't possible.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add about the Mercedes is that exactly what Andrew said, they sort of finally seem to have got their heads around this ground effect era of Formula One, but of course they've done that 2 or 3 years behind where everyone else finally got to grips with it, and so their learning curve and their development curve is that far behind as well. So I guess it's to be expected that they're not maybe quite on par with the likes of McLaren, but they have taken steps forward. And if you look inside that team, they've had a major loss in Lewis Hamilton moving to Ferrari. They have, though, had George Russell, who has been over the last few years a really solid driver, somewhat under the radar, I guess, to some extent, but has stepped up to lead that team, and he is delivering the results that the car deserves. Maybe he's even delivering better results than that car deserves. So they can give a lot of credit to the management, the team behind the drivers for delivering a car, but also for both of their drivers, including young Kimi Antonelli, for doing a solid job in the first opening couple of races.
Yeah, I mean, for George Russell, he's enjoying his best ever start to an F1 season, and for Kimi Antonelli, in his first 3 races, he's finished in the top 6. Nobody's done that since Lewis Hamilton in 2007. So all the hype around Kimi Antonelli, it wasn't the easiest of starts to the year in Australia, I think, for all of the rookies, but certainly he's coming on throughout each race weekend, as the green light is now on at the end of the pit lane. So for those who wish to do a sync-up, it's 59 minutes and 43, 42, 41 seconds remaining, but no one in a mad rush to head out on track just yet.
It's also worth saying about Mercedes that Russell was the closest to the McLarens on race pace yesterday as well, a couple of tenths behind. Not everybody ran the same tyres, but again, he was the closest. But basically, we've got the situation. The reason no one's going out is the same reason why there were 6 rookies in first practice, is because these daylight sessions in Bahrain are not that useful to the teams, because it's pretty hot. It's 32.5 degrees air temperature. That's a little cooler than it was yesterday, but still hot. And the track temperature, more to the point, 43.5 degrees. Once the sun goes down and you lose the solar radiation, the track temperature drops significantly, and of course qualifying and the race happen at twilight into dark, so we have got a Haas out, but that's why the teams they don't pay too much attention to what happens in these sessions, because the tyres behave so differently in the hot temperatures.
It's Ollie Behrman in the Haas who has dared to go out onto the track. There is a lot of running here in terms of support categories as well, which will help with the grip. We've already had some, I think there's some Porsches running along with Formula 3 and Formula 2 this weekend, but Behrman just making his way through the sweepers that make up the middle sector of this lap for downhill braking into the right-hander of turn 8, as you then head uphill to one of the more technical parts of the track, Mark, and often as they come into almost a never-ending double left-hander with a real pinch point at the apex of turn 10, you can see a lot of lockups there.
Yeah, it's one of the sort of quirks of this circuit, and probably the most challenging sector, because it has this unique combination where you're braking heavily ahead of a very slow turn and then onto a very long straight. You're also putting steering input into the steering wheel. So when you turn the wheels on a Formula 1 car, you adjust the geometry, of course, and that minimises or reduces the contact patch between the tyre and the racetrack. And when you're doing that whilst also braking and screaming out for as much grip as you can, when you minimise that contact patch, you very easily can lock up the brakes. We've seen lots of drivers do that. That obviously both damages tyres, but also puts you wide and compromises you all the way down that long back straight. So you get it right, you can acquire a lot of lap time for your overall performance. But if you get it wrong, it can cost you by the same amount.
Ollie Behrman staying out there and embarking on a first flying lap. He's on the hard tyre and is making his way down the just over 1 kilometre long start-finish straight before he heads into turn 1, the right hand, and quickly you're coming back on yourself through the left-hand kink of 2 as it rises steadily uphill towards turn number 4, where you really do take the car out wide, almost running off the track. That's how much curve some of these cars take to try and widen the turning point in the corner as you make your way through the right-hander of 4, coming into those sweepers. First of all, turn 6 through the right-hand side, then the left of 7, as you then head back downhill into the braking zone of turn 8 through the right-hander again. Very easy to run the car out wide there. Behrman keeping it pointed in the right direction, nice and steady on his opening flyer. And now we get to that technical section, turn 9 and 10. No lockups in sight for Behrman, and very quickly as you apply the throttle and up through the gears, the DRS line comes and you press the button to open your rear wing, give you a few kilometers an hour of extra speed before you're heading into turn 11. More sweeping corners to see off the final sector of this lap. The fastest corner on this track is the right-hander of turn 12, where Behrman makes his way through now, getting up towards 245 kilometers an hour before you head through the right-hander of turn 13, and then down the back straight as Behrman is joined on track now by Lewis Hamilton and his teammate Esteban Ocon. Just 2 more corners to go then for Behrman that see off this lap. First of all is the right-hander of turn 14, and then it's not really a corner, but we count it as one anyway. Turn 15, taken flat out, a slight right-hand kink. The DRS line comes again, then the start finish straight, and that's a lap around Bahrain for Ollie Bearman on the hard tyre, and it's a 1:37.825 to kick things off.
Yeah, and if you're joining us for the first time this weekend, we spoke about this yesterday, but one of the big challenges around here, particularly in this session, one of the reasons that people are hesitant to do too much learning in this particular FP3 practice session, is that it's about tyre management, and specifically tyre temperature management. The ambient temperature is very hot right now, the track surface is also very hot, but the nature of the circuit is there's a lot of heavy braking events at the end of long straights where you're really leaning on the front tyres. It's about longitudinal load, balancing that weight transfer from rear to front as you head under the braking. But then also when you come out of these slow corners, it's about getting the power down, and the tendency, or the easy thing to do, is to spin up the rear tyres. The moment you do that, you ask too much of them, the temperature spikes, and that just carries through the lap. And if you overheat your tyres early in the lap, it compromises you for the rest of the entire circuit. So the challenge from a driving point of view is to not take too much out of the tyres early on, so that you save enough for the end of the lap. But of course, if you overdo that, you lose some time on the table. So a lot of the practice sessions are really about that, learning how your drivers and your car spends its tyre performance, if you like, over the course of a lap without overheating things.
Well, let's see how Lewis Hamilton gets on with those struggles. He's making his way now down for his first flyer on the soft tyre, the quickest of the rubber Pirelli have brought this weekend, hardest in the range when it comes to the C3, the C2 and the C1 tyre. The C3 acting as the soft as he makes his way up towards turn 4. Sunshine out, blue skies above, interrupted by some cloud cover, with temperatures, air temperature just under 32 degrees, track temperature just over 43 degrees, with a slight blow of the wind in the air, and Hamilton already up on Ollie Bearman's time.
And one of the difficulties, if you were a team yesterday that didn't have the cleanest of sessions, so a lot of people outside of McLaren who had a lot of work to do over the course of Friday night, both at the track but also back at their European facilities, understanding data, trying to make improvements to the car. What you really want to do in FP3 is get the cars out on the circuit to find out whether those changes have made the improvements you're after. But of course, we're doing that in a completely different type of session here, as we talked about earlier on, where the sun's out, the temperatures are really sky high, and it's very different to when it matters later on. And the danger is, you get the car on circuit now, it either behaves as you want or it doesn't, and you either make changes or not based on that performance that's happening right now. And then when you get to qualifying later on, when things have changed quite dramatically at times, you can find yourself with a very different picture. So yes, you want to be on track right now because you need to try and get an understanding and a feel for the car, but you've got to be hesitant about making too many drastic changes as a result of what you learn here, because it might all change later. So if you're McLaren, for example, who finished on Friday in a very strong position, certainly wouldn't be wanting to change too much overnight, they can afford to sit a large part of this session out without having to come out to test too much.
Lewis Hamilton bails out of his lap at the end. There is actually a fairly strong wind out on track. Some of the Lewis Hamilton fans in the grandstand holding up a LH44 flag and it fluttering around in the wind. Let's bring you up to speed with how the championship looks, seeing as there's not a lot of action going out on track. It is Lando Norris who leads the Drivers' Championship by 1 point to Max Verstappen in the Red Bull. Then it's Oscar Piastri with the two Mercedes drivers, George Russell and Kimi Antonelli, rounding out the top 5. And over in the Constructors' Championship, it is McLaren who lead the way. They have 111 points, 36 clear of the next best, McLaren. Then comes Red Bull, Ferrari and Williams, the top 5. Ahead of Haas, Aston Martin are 7th, with Racing Bulls and Sauber in 9th. Alpine 10th and last, still the only team yet to get off the mark. 51 points and 51 minutes, I should say, and 22 seconds remain of free practice 3, the final practice session before we get going for qualifying later on this afternoon. But as we've said, that will be under the lights, cooler temperatures, so very difficult for teams and drivers to really find any more learnings during this kind of session and fine-tune their cars, but going out nonetheless, because track time is always good to gather some sort of data. One theme that is constantly impressing me at the moment, at least over, well, actually, yes, since the start of the season, I'm kind of looking now at the best of the rest, is Racing Bulls. They seem to have made a really driver-friendly car. Isaac Hadjar with a brilliant result last time out in Japan to get his first points, his Ocon first.
Yes, a lot of bouncing in front word, still difficult to go flat, pretty because of it.
from Esteban Ocon, finding the fastest corner on the circuit, turn 12. That's the right-hander, sweeps you uphill, and finding his Haas bouncing around there. So still struggling, perhaps the wind playing a factor there too in his Haas. He is out there on the hard tyre, has now come into the pits. His teammate Behrman is still out there, and the two Ferraris on track on the soft tyre. Hadjar got his first points in the Racing Bulls last time out. Tsunoda has looked good from the start of the season in that Racing Bulls. It went awry really in the first two races, I think more down to strategy than actual performance. So they theoretically should have more points on the board than they currently do. But that car, it looks like a well-produced car from the team.
Yeah, it does, and it's been kind of highlighted as such, I think, because of the struggles going on at the main team at Red Bull. Although Max Verstappen is still managing to drag some great results out of the Red Bull racing car, all the talk, if you like, or a lot of the talk has been about his teammate and then the changing of the guard between Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda. And when you brought, you brought Liam Lawson into that main team, here's Behrman quickly.
Crazy how bad the grip is compared to the main. It's quite impressive.
There you go, that's exactly what we're talking about. The big differences that you have to be very careful to factor in when you start dialing your car in a session like this. With Racing Bulls, Liam Lawson in the Red Bull racing car, as we know, struggled massively, and at the time those struggles just highlighted how good Racing Bulls were. Sorry, Liam Lawson in the Red Bull car. Racing Bulls were actually qualifying and racing in a far better position than he was. And then when you swap them back round again, now Tsunoda's struggling in the Red Bull racing car, and actually Hadjar and Lawson's there or thereabouts in the Racing Bulls. So it does feel like, you're absolutely right, I think the car is more drivable. It maybe has a larger performance window, and therefore the drivers that are in that car are more easily able to exploit its performance at different racetracks.
So Tsunoda was saying on Thursday exactly that, Mark. He was saying that when he was driving in Japan, people might have noticed, for example, that he was competitive in first practice and then not so in second practice in Suzuka. And he had changed the setup. He thought he'd found a better setup because the car felt more drivable, more friendly for him. But when he drove it, he found it was slower, and he had to put it back on the knife edge, the knife edge max setup, for want of a better way of describing it, to make the car quick, which is not a surprise given that's the way the car's been designed for Max, effectively. Well, not for Max, but following Max's setup. I want a sharper front, so they developed the car to have a sharper front because he's the quickest driver. That's the way you would do it, obviously. And so Tsunoda is waking up to the same reality that every other teammate that Max Verstappen has had since Daniel Ricciardo has had, which is that they basically can't drive the car the way Max can drive it, but that's the way the car has to be driven for it to be as fast as it can be. Yeah,
and up until this season and maybe towards the tail end of last season, you have to say Red Bull have kind of got that right, haven't they? They've been dominant. I mean, 2023 was just, no one was in the same ballpark as Red Bull Racing, in the hands of Max at least. For large parts of last year as well, the design and the characteristics of that Red Bull car seemed to be the way to go because it was the class-leading car for large periods. So only now when it's not, and even Max is not happy with the way that Red Bull car is right now at this early point in the season, are we starting to understand really some of these specific nuances about what's required of it to get the best out of it, and how really specific the driving style has to be. Max clearly has that, and even now he's struggling on certain days to really get the maximum performance out of it. Lots of other drivers are struggling to bring that same driving style and their characteristics to match up with the specific characteristics of the car.
Yeah, well, let's see. Max, of course, missed out on FP1 for Red Bull. In place was Ayumu Iwasa as part of that rookie running that was quite prevalent throughout the grid. But FP1, much like this session, in the daytime. So how much meaningful running did he actually lose out on is the question. The two Ferraris are currently fastest on the soft tyre they've been putting in the laps. It's Lewis Hamilton with a 1:34.846 ahead of Charles Leclerc on a 1:34.9. Then it's Esteban Ocon in the Haas, followed by Ollie Behrman, his teammate, the top four drivers to set any kind of lap time, and emerging from the pit lane out on track at the moment using the medium tyre are the two Alpine drivers, Jack Doohan and Pierre Gasly. I mean, once again, Mark, they lie at the bottom with 0 points, and I think it's unfair to say that's because the car is way off the pace. I think it highlights how tight that midfield pack is. But for a team that seems like it's been constantly trying to rebuild and find a way forward, now they've got Oliver Oakes as the team principal, Flavio Briatore as a senior advisor in that team coming back. This is not what they want to see in these early stages.
No, and I think the other side of that story is that actually some of the other teams around the midfield, notably Williams, but also Racing Bulls, have taken leaps forward. So it may not just be that that the Alpines have gone backwards, but they haven't improved at the rate that some of those around them have.
So in terms of pace, average pace so far over the season, the Alpine is actually the 8th quickest car. So it's actually quicker than the Haas and the Sauber. The Sauber is still the slowest car, but they haven't delivered points with it. Whereas, for example, Ollie Behrman in the Haas was outstanding in Japan, got a point for 10th place. Have Sauber got any points?
Yeah, Hulkenberg in Australia because of the rain.
That's right, yeah. So he, I guess, experience. Also, Nico Hulkenberg is renowned for being good in the wet. So they benefited from that, whereas I guess Alpine haven't had those kind of races, and it hasn't helped them, of course, that their second driver, Jack Doohan, has had 2 expensive, massive crashes in 3 races, which has also set them back. They're also suffering for the fact that the Renault stroke Alpine engine remains the worst engine on the grid. So I think you've got to offset their car against the engine deficit, which is real and significant. I mean, it's not like massive, but it's definitely significant, which is why Renault as a company made the decision to stop producing Formula 1 engines, controversially for many, but they did it anyway last year, and so this will be the last year for the foreseeable future of a Renault engine in Formula 1.
I bet they can't wait for next year, because
get a nice Mercedes unit in the back of that.
Yeah, it's a slight unknown because we're going into this next set of regulations, but you know, you'd say that because it's a Mercedes and the success they've had and the long period of time they've been working on that engine, it's probably going to be better than what they got.
Well, one of the things people may remember, there's been a bit of a saga around, you know, engines in Formula 1 over the last few weeks. It's ended up with it going nowhere. Nothing's going to change, basically.
Well, it's all going to change, but nothing's going to change from the proposed regulations.
Yes, nothing's going to change from what was changing already, exactly. But one of the reasons why that became a thing was there is a concern about the 2026 regulations. First of all, there's a sort of generic concern about whether they're going to actually be good regulations, because they designed this engine and they had to design a car that worked with that engine, and then it's like, it all looks a bit shaky. But I think teams are starting to say to me it's not going to be anywhere near as bad as people think it is, and it's probably not going to be that different from now. I can get into that in a bit more technical detail if you want to, but later in this session, if this session gets really boring. But the other fear is that one manufacturer might have an advantage over the others, and the word on the street in Formula 1 at the moment is that Mercedes are ahead on those 26 engines. And of course nobody actually knows, but then nobody actually knew in 2013 ahead of 2014. And lo and behold, all the rumours back then were Mercedes are ahead, they're going to have an advantage, and that's exactly what transpired in 2014. Don't know whether it's going to be as big an advantage next year as it was in 2014, but it does feel like the Mercedes is going to be the engine to have next year. Whereas Red Bull, the word is they're really in quite a bit of trouble, and so it's perhaps not a coincidence that along with Mohammed Ben Sulayem, the FIA president, Christian Horner was quietly in the background pushing this V10 idea, because I think they're a bit concerned. They're not admitting it, of course. Red Bull would never admit anything like that, but the word is that they are struggling a bit with their engine for next year.
Just continuing on that slightly, a team like Sauber, for instance, who are going to become Audi. Jonathan Wheatley is now in his position as team principal, having served as gardening leave from Red Bull, and he's now sat on the pit wall. His first race was in Japan. Still got Mattia Binotto still involved in that team as well as the technical operator and the chief operating officer, together kind of leading that team forward as they morph into Audi. But even though Audi are somewhat at an advantage because they are able to put in a lot of testing of their new engine right now without kind of being interrupted by anything else and having to think about what's going on now, where their team are at the moment, which is, as Andrew has on his stats, the slowest of them all, that's not what a big German manufacturer wants to see when they're about to embark on a Formula 1 challenge.
Well, they've bought Sauber, haven't they? They bought the worst team in Formula 1, and they've got to turn it into not the worst team, very much not the worst team. And I think they realise we're finally getting some proper drivers out, by the way. Norris and Verstappen both on quick laps at the moment. Not that Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc aren't proper drivers.
Yeah, careful what you say,
but actual real front runners, winners, is what I meant by that rather misspoken phrase that I used there. Anyway, yeah, they've got a lot of work to do, and they recognise it, which is why Mattia Binotto, who's the chief operating and chief technical officer of that team, whereas Jonathan Wheatley's the team principal, in a kind of dual leadership programme, is why he's been talking about their task being of Everest-like proportions. And Harry, who's gone quickest?
Yeah, it's Lando Norris. Shock, who has gone quickest, but there are cars going wide and all over the shop. Gabriel Bortoleto a few moments ago had a couple of big moments in his Sauber. Max Verstappen coming into the left-hander of turn 11, running out wide. The wind, according to Yuki Tsunoda a few moments ago when we heard him on the radio, has really picked up, coming across the circuit, I think from sort of an easterly direction, but certainly the last graphic we saw was it's picked up by about 10 kilometres per hour, that wind, which is really having an effect on the cars.
Yeah, that's terrible.
And that's what Verstappen had to say about his little moment coming through turn 11.
Yeah, there's basically a tailwind into turn 11 is what the wind is at the moment, and a tailwind reduces your downforce, and what we saw happen just then was Verstappen ran wide through turn 11, and it's almost certainly because the wind has caught him out a little bit there on the corner entry.
And it's really difficult, like we were saying earlier. This is the last time you're in the car before when it really matters in qualifying. And this is your last feeling of what your car's like. You take whatever confidence level you have from this session, which with all the caveats we've talked about being different in terms of conditions, underrepresentative, you then go into the next session that really matters with that level of confidence. So, Verstappen feeling the way he is, things could feel completely different without touching the car later on. But as a driver, the temptation is always to make a change because you can't bear the thought of getting back in the car feeling like that when the session that you're into is qualifying, and it's really important. So as a team, there's always this balance to temper what your driver's feeling with the sort of emotions as he gets out the car and thinking it's all terrible and doom and gloom, with a little bit of perspective that things could well look very different in a few hours' time once the sun's gone down.
38 minutes and 5 seconds remain on free practice 3. It's Lando Norris fastest as his teammate embarks on his flying lap. We'll see where Piastri goes, but in the meantime it's a 1:33.796 Norris has to his name, a second ahead of Lewis Hamilton. Then it's Hülkenberg, Leclerc, the top four all on soft tyres. Then it's the two Alpines on the mediums, Gasly ahead of Doohan. Tsunoda is 7th on the hard, made that 8th as Lance Stroll has just popped up into 7th. Ocon is 9th with Behrman rounding out the top 10 ahead of Bortoleto. No time on the board yet from Max Verstappen. Piastri's on his lap at the moment, still waiting for laps from Sainz and Albon, who are out there and not even emerging onto the circuit yet. Hadjar in the Racing Bulls, Antonelli's Mercedes, Lawson's Racing Bulls, and George Russell's Mercedes. As Piastri makes his way down towards turn 11, Fernando Alonso has creeped up into second place in his Aston Martin, 4/10 adrift of Norris.
I'll tell you what, so Piastri was up by a tenth and a half or so on his first sector on this lap. He's just coming to the end of the second sector. Let's see where he is compared to Norris when he gets there. Yes, he's half a second up now. And so far this weekend, obviously it's still early days, but it looks like Piastri's had a little bit of an edge on Norris for ultimate pace around Bahrain. But we'll see if that carries on through the weekend.
Ran a little bit out wide coming through turn 13, just unsettling the rear slightly as he rumbled over the red and white curbs. Takes the final two corners nicely. Piastri, that's the sound of the Australian, to the top of the timings. 4/10 clear of Lando Norris in his McLaren, almost half a second.
And that's one of the most interesting aspects of this year. We've got the whole can anyone beat McLaren thing. But there's also, last year Norris was convincingly the better McLaren driver. I think Piastri only out-qualified him 3 or 4 times all year. Piastri won a couple of races, but generally Norris was the quicker guy. And Piastri set himself the target over the winter of ironing out what he felt were his inconsistencies and performing at his highest level everywhere, and so far it really looks like he's done it. 4 races, obviously we're only in the 4th race, but if he can do it this weekend, that'll be 4 race weekends where he has really been absolutely level pegging with Norris, and which, you know, that's not good news for Norris, because it's going to mean it's great news for us, because we get to see, regardless of whether anyone else can compete with McLaren, we get to see what should be a really interesting fight between those two guys for the World Championship.
Yeah, you do only need two to make a really interesting fight. You're absolutely right. One of the things I know inside the team is that Mark Webber, Oscar Piastri's manager, has been drumming into Oscar the need to establish himself early in this championship, specifically because if they do have the dominance that it looks like from these early rounds, at some point McLaren are going to have to start making decisions about potentially favouring one driver, but even in a Grand Prix situation, the things like the prime pit stop strategy go to the lead driver on track. And so the importance to be in front, both in every Grand Prix, but also as the season rolls on, gets ever more important. And that's something, as you rightly said, Andrew, that Oscar Piastri didn't have the luxury of last year. This year he wants to make that different. Yeah, so
there's two different things in play, aren't there? So, and one of them depends on whether there's going to be any rivals for the championship. At the moment, obviously, they're competing with Verstappen. He's only 1 point behind Norris, who's leading the championship. And while Verstappen's in the mix, then yes, the questions about things like pit stop priority and whether McLaren have to make decisions to favour one driver or another later in the year, it's certainly not going to happen yet. Those are very real things. If Verstappen falls away and it becomes only a Norris-Piastri fight, then it becomes a question of only you need to be in front, because once you're in front in a teammate battle, you get to control the situation, you get to control the race. Even if it's only you against your teammate, they'll always give the lead driver the prime strategy, because that's the way every Formula One team works.
Can you be a nice guy in Formula One and be a world champion?
Well, we're going to find out this year, aren't we? Because I think Norris and Piastri are both nice guys, so they're not, in the sense of, they're not, I mean, I think, you know, I actually like Max Verstappen, I like Lewis Hamilton as people, but, you know, they are ruthless, particularly Verstappen. But Norris and Piastri have definitely played the McLaren team game. You know, they are accepting of McLaren's way of approaching racing, in, you know, not having a number one driver and so on. But that's going to be tested to the absolute limit this year, and it's going to be really interesting to see whether the team can keep that harmony and whether the drivers continue with that approach, or whether one of them is going to go, you know, hard ass, if you like, in Formula One terms.
Careful, Benson, we're on the BBC.
I would bet my house on the fact that they won't be able to maintain harmony if they are in a championship fight where just those two drivers are fighting for the world title. I think I've said this hundreds of times on this show and others. I don't believe it's possible when all of a sudden your teammate becomes the one thing standing in the way of you and the world title, to suddenly remain friends, to remain jovial, to not think solely about yourself. And that's absolutely the right thing to do as a Formula One driver, and it's one of the quirks of Formula One. We have a team game and an individual game happening at the same time, and on rare occasions, like we could see, we saw it at 2007, 2008 with 2007 with McLaren, we saw it with Nico Rosberg, Lewis Hamilton. We rarely, when we've seen it way back earlier in the sort of 80s and 90s, it doesn't happen that often, but when it does, there's always fireworks.
I always think about what happened in Qatar, the sprint last year, and that was a response, Lando Norris pulling out of the way in the final corner on the last lap to give Oscar Piastri the win as a thank you for helping him out in the previous sprint in Sao Paulo. Now bear in mind, at that point of the season, Piastri was really no longer in the fight.
That's the point.
But I still think to have pulled out of the way, that is not every driver would do that. If you compare it to the year before, where there was a bit of chat over Brazil and they were trying to cement Sergio Perez at Red Bull getting second in the Drivers' Championship, and he needed something like 7th place. And they were asking Verstappen to help him out, and he point blank refused. And this is over small points that wouldn't have meant anything to Max Verstappen, but he could have helped his team out, and he didn't.
It comes down to personalities at the end of the day, like it does in any walk of life. The only time I can ever remember, and certainly in my time, where things didn't get really over the top heated, was the Jenson-Button World Championship in 2009, when really they were the only major contenders. It was between, again, two teammates generally for the most, and they they tended to not, they didn't turn into all-out war, but on every other occasion I think it pretty much has.
Well, that was really because Rubens Barrichello, who was Jenson Button's teammate at the time, wasn't really opposing him.
It was a half championship fight.
Button won 6 of the first 7 races, and Barrichello hadn't won any at that point. And the interloper in there was Sebastian Vettel in the Red Bull, who won in the wet in China in the first part of the year, and then it was Vettel who emerged as the main contender against Button, as Button's sort of season kind of unravelled in the second half before he finally got it back together again in Brazil. What's interesting for me about this year, though, is that Norris makes quite a play about, you know, not feeling like he has to conform to Formula One archetypes, if you like, and that's what I mean by it's going to really test them, because I don't know, I might be wrong, but I just get the feeling, here's Lawson's radio.
The wind is making a big difference into 11 especially.
Oh, Lawson's been listening to my commentary. I get the feeling that Norris and Piastri, they might just be 2 guys who might be able to keep a level of equanimity between them within the team, in the way that, you know, Jim Clark and Graham Hill might have done, for example, in the 60s, when the drivers, you know, when the drivers were more friendly than they were for a time in the 80s and 90s, and so on. So I could be wrong, and it may all fall apart in like catastrophic explosive style at McLaren.
Is it bad that I kind of want to see that happen?
But if it's going to, I think if it's going to happen with anyone, I think it's going to happen with those 2 guys.
Car with the 20 still, just by itself. What's going on? Car switch itself off, engine is off.
That's Nico Hülkenberg, who's stuck on the runoff area by turn 8. Yellow flag, followed by a virtual safety car. He's pulled well off the racing line, and by a nice gap in the barrier, so the marshals will hopefully be able to wheel him away. But the anti's still kicking in without catching him by surprise, and that's rather halted the Germans running. He'd just put in a decent lap on the soft tyre to get himself up into 7th spot in his Sauber. And 15 years ago it was Nico Hülkenberg making his Grand Prix debut at this track. It's a long old career for Nico Hülkenberg, and sadly still no podiums to show for it.
Still without a podium, unbelievable. I mean, he'll be, you know, he signed a deal with you know, what will be Audi, of course, which is a big deal, you know, joining a major manufacturer, German as well. All hopes would have been that, you know, maybe that's his one last big roll of the dice, and could he finally do it? But as we just talked about earlier on, they are coming in at such a big deficit that it could end up taking them some time. You know, no one really knows what's going to happen next year, and there's an element of excitement about that.
Guys, let me know what you want me to do.
Yeah, it doesn't look like we can get going again, Nico.
Stephen Petrick on the radio talking to his driver Nico Hülkenberg, who looks like his session might be done with 27 minutes and 55 seconds on the clock. I mean, Nico's 37 this year. He'll turn 38 in August. He could still go for another 6-7 years if you're going by the Alonso Hamilton markers. I know he's not an Alonso and Hamilton.
That's the point, I think. I mean, look, they won't admit this, but they signed him because he's German, Audi, and they're still in that we have to have a German driver mode.
And it was a different management team
team who signed him. I don't know whether I don't know what his contract, I'm assuming it's going to be 2 years plus 1 maybe as an option. I'd be very surprised if he got another contract. I don't think Audi will be winning races or being in podium contention. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think they'll be in podium contention by then. So I think they'll end up with somebody else in that car.
VSC is ending, by the way, as they wheel away Nico Hülkenberg. So, I mean, we don't think Audi are going to be there. We may be wrong. But what about a team like Cadillac when they come in?
I think it's the same thing applies to Audi as it does to Cadillac/Ford. You know, on one hand, yes, they've got a few more freedoms just to be developing in the background now, and that's clearly an advantage. But the massive disadvantage is that you have no experience of this era of Formula One. And although things are changing next year, in fact, a lot's changing, so there's an element of levelling the playing field through that, your relevant and recent experience in Formula One still counts for so much operating at this high level. So I still think it's an enormous challenge for the newcomers into this sport.
Cadillac's a really interesting question, so let's remind everybody, Cadillac are coming into Formula 1 next year.
I actually kind of can't believe it's that quick all of a sudden.
Yeah, exactly. They're suddenly coming in, and they're going to have a Ferrari engine for the first few years. GM have said that they are going to build their own engine, but we don't know when yet because they haven't given it a date, but we're thinking maybe 29 or so, and that's again another factor in this engine conversation at the moment is, do you change the rules to simplify the engines, make it easier for GM to be competitive? There's so many things in the mix on that scenario at the moment. But anyway, up and down, I mean, you could call this Formula One arrogance if you like, but up and down the pit lane, I don't know a single person who thinks Cadillac are going to be anywhere other than right at the back next year. Now, of course, that depends on how bad some of the engines are. So, for example, if the Audi engine, for example, isn't competitive at all, then that might make a difference because, the Ferrari engine might be better. But most people think that team, given its run-up, given the structure that it's got, who it's employing, no one sees any prospect of them being anywhere close to being competitive next year.
Okay, I'm just trying to think back to the last new team in Formula One. That was Haas, who came in, and they had they basically had they still do, technical partnership with Ferrari, and they basically bought as many parts from Ferrari as they could to bolt on their car, and they weren't plumb last. They did a decent job, but it's the difference here. Cadillac are coming in fresh, and they are building their own car. But look, with the Ferrari engine.
Haas have been in Formula 1 for nearly 10 years. Have they made any progress?
No, they've been in the middle.
Right, they
pretty much constantly.
They went backwards from where they started, or certainly where they got to in 2017-18 when they had. Now, you could argue that the reason they were competitive in 2017-18 was because that was when Ferrari had the best car. They didn't deliver a championship in it because between Vettel and the team they messed it up. But they had the best car for large portions of the 2017 and 18 season, so it's probably not an accident or a surprise that those were the years that Haas were most competitive, because Haas were buying everything from Ferrari apart from the aerodynamic surfaces. And of course, if you're buying the suspension and the gearbox and the suspension mounting points and everything you can, then you are buying you're buying a leg up on aerodynamics, even if you're not buying the aerodynamics. But yeah, that just goes to show how hard it is to succeed in Formula One. And I think this is the thing that Audi are going to have to come to terms with, and I think it's good that they've got people like Mattia Binotto and Jonathan Wheatley running that team now, because I think corporate Audi, corporate Volkswagen Group, the difference for them is, yes, they've won in every motorsport championship they've gone to. Le Mans, they won for many, many years with Audi. Bentley, of course, as well, which was effectively a rebranded Audi car. They've won in World Rallying. They set the record at Pikes Peak with that electric IDR thing, whatever it was. But I'm not sure that corporate Audi, until people like Binotto and Wheatley got involved, understood how much of a step up in terms of competitive intensity Formula One is compared to any other form of motorsport. And this is what people in America don't understand. IndyCar is fine, but it's so far below the level of competitiveness and excellence that there is in Formula One. It's almost another planet to come to Formula One and try and win, and that's what Audi have got to face up to.
And I'm of the opinion that because of that level that Formula One's at, both technical but also operational, the talent across all aspects of Formula One is so high, and it should be, because it's the pinnacle, that you shouldn't be able to come in as a newcomer and suddenly challenge for a world title. I know many fans will disagree, because from a pure entertainment spectacle, we want that, we want close racing. But I feel like if it's that easy that, not just anybody, but somebody can come in and in their first attempt mix it with the big boys, I feel like we're undermining what really Formula One is, which is absolute excellence in pretty much every area.
I agree, but the last thing we want is to go back to where we were in 2010, right, where we had 3 new teams come in and they were just way off the pace, and they had their own battle for 10th in the Constructors' Championship.
Here's Lawson.
Dude, just so annoying. No point to do that.
There's somebody whizzing past the inside when he was on a prep lap, and it looked like somebody overtook him whilst he was trying to make space, I guess, so that's what frustrated him. I agree with you, but back in 2010 we weren't under this cost cap, and that's the big difference now. So the playing field has been levelled to some extent. So you shouldn't have the gulf. Yes, of course, if you're a Haas or one of these teams that came in back then, the gulf between whoever you were and the likes of Ferrari, Mercedes, they're spending $300+ million a year. Well, now that isn't the case. So now you can come in on at least a level financial playing field, and it then just comes down to experience and expertise, the right people, the right procedures, and all those things that you will learn, hopefully over the course of the first year in the sport, and then be competitive. But I think it would be a big ask for somebody like that to come in their first attempt and really mix it at the front.
Well, either way, I'm going to love seeing it, and it's brilliant totally, for the sport to have Audi. We're not getting a new team in Audi. They're absorbing the Sauber group, and to get a brand new team, 2 new drivers, 2 more drivers on the grid as well. I think that's what a lot of people are excited to see too.
I'm losing my left mirror.
Copy.
I think he's lost it by the looks of it. That's Charles Leclerc, and this is the sound on board the Monegasque as he comes into the left-hander of turn 10, and there is not a mirror to be seen on the left-hand side.
It's also worth saying that a mirror is not just a mirror these days. A mirror is also an aerodynamic device. You can see all the mirrors are sort of contained within different bits of bodywork that are doing different bits of flow shaping.
I'd argue a mirror is the least use of it sometimes.
Yes, exactly.
They're not all. They can't see a whole lot out of that mirror, and are they actually ever using it that much? We're about to see where it flew off. This is the run down towards the final corner, and it just goes under braking, and it's gone into the ether.
Yeah, it's you give engineers and designers a scope or a space of the car within these imaginary boxes to put something. Even if you say it has to be a mirror, they will make some sort of aerodynamic use out of it, and that's exactly what they do.
90 minutes and 40, 39, 38, 37 seconds remain. It's still Oscar Piastri who heads the field by 0.2 of a second. Max Verstappen is second. He split the 2 McLarens because Norris is third. Alonso with a nifty time on the soft tyre earlier on, enough for fourth at the moment. Ahead of the 2 Ferraris, and now mirrorless Charles Leclerc is fifth ahead of Lewis Hamilton and Pierre Gasly. The top 7, they are all in the pits. Nico Hülkenberg is 7th. He's now out of this session after running into anti-stall issues. Liam Lawson is 9th ahead of Isaac Hadjar. Then it's Doohan. Russell's up to 12th ahead of Tsunoda. Antonelli. Alex Albon the top 15. Then comes Stroll and Sainz. Gabriel Bortoleto is 18th ahead of the 2 Haas drivers with Esteban Ocon and Ollie Behrman 20th and last.
Still quite a bit of flow viz on the cars. That's one thing that you can learn, even though the temperatures and the surface of the track is very different. The aerodynamic characteristics remain pretty much unchanged. So lots of teams and cars with this flow visualization paint sprayed across. Some of the aerodynamic upgrades have been brought. And once you get the car out on the circuit, it's mixed with paraffin, which allows it to be runny and follow the airstreams running around the car, but then dries very quickly, and the paint within that dries, sort of cementing the flow lines, if you like, of the aerodynamics in the car. So it's a nice way for the engineers and the aerodynamicists to see in the real world where the airflow is going. The problem is, of course, it's also nice for every other team to be able to see. So teams put quite a lot of effort into trying to hide it as soon as it comes back to the garage, take pictures and wash it off as quickly as possible.
Yeah, we're watching the south of Gabriel Bortoleto with flow viz all over the rear wing, and currently trying to evaluate that. I wonder on Bortoleto, the mentality of the rookie, having been, as he runs wide on the exit of turn 13 and scuppers that lap but still keeps his foot in it, the mentality of winning Formula 2 and being at the forefront of that championship and being the next best thing. You know, he actually went into Formula 3 and kind of out of nowhere won the championship. No one was expecting him to do it. First year in Formula 2, wins the championship. Very much the Oscar Piastri path. Yeah. And then his opportunity to get on the Formula 1 grid, it lies with Sauber. He's at the back. There's no realistic chance of scoring points unless there is a crazy race, and that happened. Unfortunately, he hit the wall whilst his teammate took the points. Experience over lack of it there. But that must be a really hard shift in your brain to manage.
It's so often the case when you come into Formula 1, because typically you get to Formula 1 by winning, you know, all of your other championships you've been part of. So you become a serial winner. You become used to winning. You expect to win. And then there's often this harsh reality check when you get here and you're in amongst a completely new level of both driver but also the technology and the teams. And actually to win in Formula 1, as we've been discussing, is incredibly difficult. And it tends to be as well reserved for one or two teams over the course of most seasons. All right, last year we got a good number. This year we've already had technically 4 different winners in 4 races if you include the sprint. So there is a bit of a mix-up going, but it tends to come from the top 2 or 3 teams.
The thing is as well, for people coming in from the junior formulas, is that there's winning in the junior formulas and then there's winning in the junior formulas. You get people who, you know, they do well in the junior formulas. They win Formula 3 in their 2nd year, for example, or their 3rd year, or they win Formula 2 in their 2nd or 3rd year. And it's one bunch of drivers that they've been competing against. And then you get drivers who win bang, bang, bang all the way through the years, like Charles Leclerc, for example, George Russell, for example, Oscar Piastri as well, and Gabriel Bortoletto's done it as well. I'm not sure Bortoletto's yet proved that he's at the Piastri, Leclerc, Russell level. We've still got a bit of time to work that one out, but those two things are different. So you already come in with a reputation that if you're a Leclerc or a Russell or a Piastri. Oh, we got a spinning. Is that a Mercedes?
Spinning George Russell.
Yeah.
Round he goes. It's coming through that tight left-hander at turn 10, and he's already losing the rear as he tries to turn in. Has to have another bite at the cherry on the medium tyre, and round he goes. Full 360 degrees, or maybe just half, as spins up those rear tyres and finds himself facing the wrong way. Very
hot, those rear tyres now after all that. But then you get into Formula 1, and so the filtration system, the distillation, if you like, of talent it changes all the way through, and then you get to the thing where you're meeting everybody who hears Russell's radio.
I'd probably go as far as that was the least amount of grip I've ever had in an F1 car.
It looked like it too, like he's on an ice rink, didn't it? Or on a skid pan maybe. But and so it just because you've done well in the junior formulas doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be good enough at that rarefied level in Formula 1, and the same goes for teams. You know, just because you've won at Le Mans or in IndyCar doesn't mean you're going to win in Formula 1.
Talk of doing well, actually, Yuki Tsunoda didn't win Formula 2 and had to, I remember his last races in Formula 2 around this circuit where he really had to fight to finish in the top 6 to get the super license points in order to get the promotion to AlphaTauri, which he did do in the end. We've actually had a question come in from hashtag BBC F1 Kieran, says Red Bull's issues seem to start the first Grand Prix Adrian Newey missed on gardening leave. Is that a coincidence? Or is the effect of Newey leaving having the detrimental effect that we're seeing Red Bull go through?
So I kept asking that question last year, and Max Verstappen kept saying it shouldn't be, but Adrian Newey is not held in such high regard by accident. Adrian Newey is not just a genius level aerodynamicist. He's also an incredibly good race engineer with a really good intuitive understanding of what a Formula 1 car needs to be quick and what a Formula 1 driver needs from his car to be quick. And I don't think it's an accident or a coincidence that the minute he stepped away, Red Bull was suddenly not quite as good, and I don't think it's an accident that the minute he wasn't there anymore, it's taking them this long to work out how to stop their car behaving in a way they don't want it to behave.
The only argument I would put forward is that, you know, last year he certainly wasn't attending all races. In fact, he wasn't attending that many races, so his impact on the ground over a Grand Prix was limited anyway, even when he was still with the team. And you're absolutely right, Andrew, he has this incredible ability, so let's not underestimate. He will definitely, and his loss will definitely be felt at the team. In terms of his main role, of course, it's designing or leading a design team, so it's about understanding what a car needs, coming up with an idea to solve that problem, designing something or getting someone to design it, and then producing it, bringing it onto the car. There's often a bit of a delay or a lag between, of course, having that idea and that idea turning up a car, and then you see the resulting performance. So I do think it's a coincidence in terms of being that specific. The day he leaves is not the day that performance drops off a cliff. It was all happening sometime before that.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, the other thing that happened at that time was McLaren brought a massive upgrade to Miami. And that transformed them from being 4 or 5 tenths off the Red Bull to being every bit as quick as the Red Bull. And then they've kept that development going. What's interesting is that they've kept the development going with Peter Pedromu, who's their technical director of aerodynamics, who used to work with Adrian Newey at McLaren and at Red Bull. And Red Bull haven't been able to keep their development going to the same degree as McLaren have. I just wanted to ask you, Mark, did you coincide with Adrian at McLaren?
Yeah, he was, I mean, I've said this story before, he was both brilliant and a massive pain in the backside at the same time.
I can think of other people I could describe like that.
Well, I'll give you a very brief example, and I may have said this before, but I remember working away on our McLaren car one year when it had this enormous barge board, sort of aero deflector behind the front suspension, and he designed it in a way that the front suspension went through it. And you'd imagine, because this is a component that gets damaged over curves quite frequently, so we end up changing them quite a lot, you'd put a big slot in that so that you could slide it over the front suspension to replace it. Adrian wasn't having that, because that slot would have cost you some tiny percentage point on the aero scale. And so to change that component, which we did every 5 minutes, you had to disassemble the entire front suspension to feed a new wishbone. And I remember he walked past me one day when I was in the garage fighting with this thing, and I said, Adrian, come here. I said, just out of interest, when you're coming up with these concepts, I said, as a percentage, just roughly, how much of that your design, philosophy goes into the practicality of people like me fitting these things, and how much into performance? And he went, absolutely none.
He went, sorry, who are you again?
But for the same reason, I have total respect. That's why he's so good. He's all in on performance. It's no compromise, and that's why the cars that he's built and designed have been serial winners.
Getting some quick lap times in now. Verstappen was fastest to be displaced by Pierre Gasly's Alpine, but Oscar Piastri is lighting up the sector times and goes fastest by 1.3 seconds. Piastri's looking quick round here. McLaren are looking quick, but Piastri is on fire. We're about to see what Norris has got in a few moments. He's on an outlap. Hadjar pops himself up into third, just to see off that the Red Bull point at Adrian Newey. Of course, he's now gone to Aston Martin. So, based on what you're saying, he should work magic, and next year they should be absolute front runners and challenging for a title, no?
Well, there's a massive regulation change coming. If you look back at the history of Adrian versus a new regulation cycle, that's exactly what he has done. He's been a serial winner when it comes to the big shifts, technical shifts in this sport, and that's exactly why Aston Martin have paid the big bucks to bring him in, because there's a huge opportunity for everybody, but particularly those midfield teams that are struggling right now. There's an opportunity to do something amazing next year, and they feel their best shot is with Adrian Newey alongside them.
I also think that obviously his prime focus is 26. They want to get the 26 car absolutely right, but I think that they're struggling at the moment, Aston Martin. I think if there's some low-hanging fruit on this car that he can see, that's a quick fix from an aerodynamic point of view, I think he's going to do that. I'd be surprised if Aston Martin don't make some significant progress as a result through the second part of this season.
He'll sprinkle a little bit of Newey magic on the Aston Martin, surely. And clearly it's, Aston Martin are making a lot of changes on the technical side. I think Dan Fallows, who was very much involved with that team as they became Aston Martin, has now departed the team almost entirely, and the group as well. So a man who worked with Adrian Newey at Red Bull, they haven't been happy with the way that car direction has been going, and they're switching it up. That was Behrman saying, man, what a mess, as he made an absolute mess of the gravel trap on the exit of turn 4. And track starting to be very busy over the last couple of minutes. We're just having a look at Jack Doohan running wide, coming through turn 11. He's on the soft tyre, doesn't run out too wide, and gets well out of it as he continues to make his way up the hill. It's Oscar Piastri with 7 minutes and 52, 51 and 50 seconds remaining of this final practice session before we go qualifying, who is fastest by 1.2 seconds over the Mercedes of Kimi Antonelli. Then it's Pierre Gasly, Isaac Hadjar, the top 4, with Max Verstappen in 5th. Esteban Ocon is 6th ahead of Liam Lawson. Lando Norris is out there at the moment on the soft tyre. We'll see what he's got if he can join his teammate up in the higher echelons in the next couple of minutes. Alex Albon, the top 10, as George Russell continues to put a shift in for Mercedes, really, as the next best after McLaren. Still 1.1 seconds adrift, though, of that Piastri time.
If the next best is over a second slower,
mighty,
that's huge, isn't it? And yes, there's only practice. And look, there's been a lot of talk about some teams run these practice sessions with their engines turned up, others don't. The regulations dictate that when you get into qualifying, you have to have your engine modes fixed for qualifying and the race. But in practice sessions, you can effectively run them in whatever mode you like. So for people saving their engine performance...
Yeah, I can't believe how fast these McLarens are at the moment.
Pretty quick, eh?
Neither can we, Pierre. Neither can we.
But yeah, but the point is, McLaren are running the same engine as George Russell. It's a Mercedes. You'd imagine the engine program is going to be very, very similar. And so if one's got it turned up in these practice sessions, you'd imagine the other would, because these are dictations that come from the engine manufacturer themselves. You get an allowable limits of running at high performance. So, for example, you could argue that Red Bull could be different, Ferrari could be different, but that looks to me like a comparable lap time between Oscar Piastri and George Russell, and it's over a second slower to the Mercedes.
And 6/10 clear of Lando Norris is Oscar Piastri, so that was Norris's first effort on the soft tyre at this stage. Should bear in mind, of course, that these conditions are going to be completely different for when we actually go qualifying and for the race. That takes place once the sun has gone down, the temperatures have cooled and the lights have come on. Right now we're doing this in the heat of the daylight, where temperatures, well, they've a little cooler than they were yesterday, but still hot. Track temperature 40 degrees, just north of that, with the air temperature just shy of 30 degrees. So we will see a change later on, but either way, whether it's in the heat of the day or in the cool of the night, McLaren have come to play this weekend. We know they are quick. They're leading the Constructors' Championship. Lando Norris leads the Drivers' Championship. But here at a track where we had pre-season testing, and that was the first real inkling that all of us and the teams got that, this could be a McLaren year once more, but even more dominance and a fight between their two drivers. Well, right now, they're backing that up.
Yeah, absolutely. But let's not underestimate the potential shift that could happen in terms of performance up and down the grid as the temperatures change as we move into the evening.
That's a good lap. We just lost a bit turn 4 last corner, but that's a really good lap.
It was quite a poor lap, but okay.
That was Carlos Sainz, by the way. Enough for 9th place.
A little disagreement. I mean, actually, if your driver's saying it's a poor lap, there's some positivity in that from a team's point of view, because if he thinks he can deliver more, then wonderful, we'll take it. But yes, the temperature's dropping as we move into the dusk setting, which will be what it will be for qualifying, can massively shift the performance. If your car's struggling with tyre temperature, as those temperatures come down, both ambient and track surface temperature, that can really swing performance in your favour. Likewise, if it's the other way around, it can swing performance away from you. Now, we don't expect McLaren to suddenly tumble down the order, but you could easily see a situation where some teams who are really struggling right now, that those conditions could come towards them, and those gaps could well be much closer. So it's not all doom and gloom for everybody outside of the papaya orange right now, but it's certainly ominous.
Ominous from McLaren. I'm a little worried about Yuki Tsunoda at the moment in the Red Bull. He hasn't looked anywhere so far this weekend. Helmut Marko saying after Friday's running, well, it's not representative because he was running an experimental setup, but at the moment he's 19th. He has been out there on the soft tyre, but we saw him sailing off through turn 1 a few moments ago, locking up in that Red Bull. He's on the hard tyre on an outlap right now, down in 19th, only ahead of Lance Stroll. So let's see if Tsunoda can find anything when it comes to qualifying. Should theoretically be a more comfortable track for him in terms of, obviously he knows Suzuka very well, but that had all of the fanfare of being his first race and of course being the home driver, whereas this should in theory be a quieter, calmer weekend for him and a follow-up to the experience he's already gained.
Yeah, I think he's getting the sudden realisation that although that car, he even said it himself, I think, it felt like it was a natural fit when he drove it in the simulator. He wasn't too worried about his driving style matching up to the Red Bull car. He's now finding that in reality, it has got some very specific requirements. And as Andrew touched on earlier on, he tried to dial out the characteristic in that Red Bull, which has it being so pointy and on the nose that means the rear end is really quite loose and twitchy. He tried to dial that back through setup and felt much more comfortable, but the lap time was much slower as a result. That's what that car needs. So look, he's down in 19th, as you said, a long way off the pace. Those are the kind of positions that meant Liam Lawson got demoted further back down the grid and back to the Racing Bulls. Red Bull don't have the luxury really of having someone else other than Hadjar, who's also very new himself, and that would seem like a fairly desperate move. They don't have the luxury of having somebody really waiting to step in. So I guess on the plus side, Tsunoda should at least get more time than Liam Lawson got.
Well, the sun is glinting off of Yuki Tsunoda's Red Bull as he's on a lap with the DRS, making his way uphill towards turn 4. He's got a Ferrari in front of him. It's Charles Leclerc, it's the only Ferrari out on track, gets nicely out of the way as Tsunoda makes his way through the left-hand curve, then the right-hand. The right hand, then the left hand, before he then heads downhill towards turn 8.
He was 1.2 seconds down, all right, on Piastri's time, but just in the first sector alone, that's a third of the lap, and he's over a second down.
He is on the hard tyre, though,
yeah,
so
he is, yeah.
That is something to take in comparison. So clearly, I wonder if they're focusing more on setting up the car for race day on Sunday, but the overtake opportunities are better here than what we saw in Suzuka, but it's not like they're massively showing themselves, so you still need to qualify well, and if we're going off of what we've seen so far, where every race has been won by the man who started from the P1 position, this is just as much of a qualifying championship as it is a race.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, look, for people that are not aware, once you do get into qualifying, the cars go into parc ferme, which means you're no longer, from the moment they roll out of the garage for the first time in qualifying, you're no longer allowed to make mechanical changes, bar a little bit of front wing flap angle and things like tyre pressures. So, you know, if they've got to the conclusion that maybe he's going to struggle in qualifying and actually a more compliant car which will do better in the race and look after tyres, if they've accepted that maybe qualifying is not going to be his strongest suit, perhaps there is an argument they will focus their development direction on giving him a good race car, which might enable him to make up positions. It's certainly far from ideal for those on that Red Bull pit wall.
Tsunoda did also run wide coming out of turn 4 on that lap as well, which would have cost him time, and he's actually fallen down to 20th and last now, so not for happy reading on the timing sheets, but perhaps maybe they know what's going on at the leading Red Bull driver, if you're taking into account the 2 Racing Bulls as well. Once again, Isaac Hadjar, who is up in 7th at the checkered flag for the rookie Frenchman. And that is it. Done and dusted. The final practice session is over. We go qualifying under the lights in just a few hours' time. But right now, it is certainly advantage McLaren. And Oscar Piastri has the edge for now over his teammate Lando Norris. It's a McLaren 1-2. Charles Leclerc third, ahead of George Russell, with Kimi Antonelli and the Mercedes rounding out the top 5. Pierre Gasly 6th, ahead of Hadjar. Then comes Max Verstappen in 8th. Carlos Sainz in 9th, with Lewis Hamilton once again struggling in that Ferrari, rounds out the top 10 ahead of the Haas of Esteban Ocon. Jack Doohan 12th, Liam Lawson 13th, Fernando Alonso finished down in 14th in his Aston Martin ahead of the Williams of Alex Albon. Then came Ollie Behrman in the Haas, followed by Lance Stroll's Aston Martin in 17th, Gabriel Bortoletto 18th. Nico Hulkenberg, with half an hour of the session to go, had some issues with the anti-stall, so he could no longer take part in the session, 19th, and Yuki Tsunoda finishing down in 20th in the Red Bull. Okay, well, my thanks to the BBC's F1 correspondent, Andrew Benson, to Mark Priestley. Join us again when we go qualifying under the lights and find out who will take pole position for the Bahrain Grand Prix. We'll be on the BBC Sport website and app, on BBC Sounds, and your chosen smart speaker will be on air from 5 to 5 this afternoon ahead of the green light at 5 o'clock. We shall see you then. This has been an IMG production for BBC Radio 5 Live.